It is time to start defining the indie game I'm working on. So I have been saying I've been working on a strategy RPG game, and I've had art streams where I do sculpts and stuff like that. So what I'm going to be doing in between the art streams and making art for the game is defining what the game is going to have in it. So to begin, let's just talk about the basic combat idea. So unlike in a game like Fire Emblem, where you select a unit, have them attack, and then the camera like zooms in to a new little like mini battle, like cutscene type interaction, the actual player units are going to be quite large. So in this case, we have Gladius as a reference. This is a game that was on Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. And in that game, you had smaller team sizes, and you selected units, you had them perform actions, and then you did a little mini game that was based on timing, where you have to hit A as a bar moves across a thing to get crit attacks, or just a hit in general. And if you got it in the wrong area, it'd be a guaranteed miss or low damage hit. So very similar to Gladius, I want like larger player models. I don't want to have like this cutaway for combat. I want the combat to take place on the board. And also you can zoom in and out depending on how much of the board you want to see. But generally the maps will be like more intimate, more smaller, so army size is smaller to focus on combat. Player selects units, have them take actions. Player scale is relatively large, so you can see the action on the game board. That's one thing I prefer in strategy games. I actually don't like when it like zooms in. I mean, it can be fine, but in terms of just like keeping the flow of the game fast and snappy, it would be much faster if it doesn't have this like cutaway transition into like a new scene, and then there's like combat, and then it exits that. So I just want it to be like moving pieces on a board type of feel. Army size will be smaller compared to games like Fire Emblem. Emphasis will be placed on outplaying your foes and using tactics and team synergy to win. So instead of just having like super units that just enemy phase or just kill a bunch of things, or using like warp tactics, like warp strats, warp staff or whatever, you're going to actually need to use the unit's abilities and come up with team comps that play off of each other. Otherwise, your team is going to lose like serious momentum against the AI, especially on like harder difficulties where the enemies will use synergy and actually look at what you're doing and respond to it. So the difficulty, like the high difficulty, what I want out of it is smart AI that actually doesn't completely read everything you're doing, but kind of generally reacts to you instead of like reading your mind and like calculating moves ahead. All right, so let's go to the next section. Let's talk about unit sizes. So unit type and sizes. So each unit has its own weight, so its own weight class and type. So like, for example, you could have like a heavy warrior, or like a heavy mage or whatever, or you could have like an average, soldier, or like a nimble thief. So there's nimble, average, and heavy. And each one of these occupies different space. Now there's 2x2s, 1x1s, and 0.7 by 0.7s. Now the 0.7s just occupy a single space, just like a 1x1, but they can also fit into narrow areas that 1x1s cannot. So imagine you have like a very thin, short thief who is physically much smaller than, like an average soldier, and they can fit in a tighter crack or something to like go through like a choke point that a larger unit cannot, because they physically cannot fit through. Or they could climb something that, a heavier unit could not, because it would fall apart. Or they can occupy spaces on high ground that a heavier unit cannot. So essentially this is going to be balanced around like routes. So like choke points, routes, alternate like attack angles. So 2x2 heavies, they're going to be like basically the best combat units in the game, but they're going to have the worst mobility as a result. So they're going to be very restricted as to what they can do in terms of mobility, whereas 1x1s are more generalist, like average power, average mobility, and then nimbles are like taken to an extreme. So when deploying units, the player on average will have 4 to 9 deploy slots, depending on the map, where higher deploy slots would be on endgame maps. Heavy units consume 2 deploy slots. So this is very important, because if you wanted to run a bunch of heavies, you're going to have a hard time doing so. You could only, at max, you could run like 4, and then like 1 of each of these. For balance purposes, average and nimble are considered 1 unit slot. Now, nimble aren't necessarily weaker than average, or vice versa. They have more high skill gameplay. So like there's going to be like inputs and like little mini games for combat to make your attacks execute. And this is done to add mechanical skill to the game. So this way, if you want to master nimble characters, you can be like, it'll be harder to do, but the result will be huge. Like the payout will be huge, whereas average characters will be easier to master, but the output, like, their performance won't be as good. It'll be good enough to beat the hardest setting, but it won't be like high skill, execution like nimble will be. Nimble units tend to be more utility focused, can deal skill-based damage. So for example, let's say nimble has like combo attack where you have to, there's like a bar. I'll go over this more in like future videos, but let's say there's like a bar and like a slider that moves. You have to hit A as the slider moves across, and you have to land like 3 to 4 semi-precise things, and each one of those is like an attack that can crit. So you could get like 4 mini crit attacks that adds up to higher damage than an average unit could deal. For example, Nimble also can provide utility / support as well as debuffs. Nimbles are 0.7 by 0.7 in terms of size. It can fit into narrow corridors, only Nimble can access. They can also climb more alternate routes and take small high ground tiles. So small high ground tiles, there's going to be 0.7 tiles. So for example, if you climb like a little area, like a short wall or something, like if you move up over like a wall and there's like a 0.7 tile, only a nimble can occupy that. So they'll have access to more high ground, which is going to be hugely useful in this game. So height and like character orientation, like what direction they're facing, are going to matter. I'll go over that in future video though. Average units. All right, so average units can fill most roles and are generalists that mostly can flex into other roles. They are 1x1s, require a moderate amount of skill to use effectively. So they're like your bread and butter basic units. Heavies will be the easiest to use in terms of combat and dealing damage, but they're going to be the hardest to position around because they're not going to have access to routes, and that could put them in danger because let's say you have a bunch of enemies that are nimbles pushing nimble flank routes and hitting your team from different angles. The heavy could be exposed to tons of damage that could end up getting them killed. So heavies could be a liability in some cases, but obviously you'd have to use your other units to play around those chokes and maybe bottleneck the enemies. So averages consist of damage dealers, counter tanks, healers, utility soldiers. There's going to be more things in this, but counter tanks are units that when they are attacked, you have your own meter. So like say an enemy's about to hit you, you have like a really rapid meter that if you pull it off, you'll counter attack them instead of getting hit. So essentially it's like a high skill tank. So you, instead of using an ability and just tanks, it's a unit that basically riposts and dodges and like nullifies damage off of skill, but they will be like weak attackers, but because they can counterattack like at base, you can use that to just like enemy phase things essentially, but it's based on skill instead of just like a build. Large units are map manipulators. So this is a thing that's cool about the large units too. So like let's say there's like a big pillar or something, and they have the manipulate skill. Now, not all large units can manipulate. Some large units are just like big and they have like damage. So there could be like some mage lady that's just like larger, but she's not like physically strong, so she can't like pick up a heavy pillar. But they could like make temporary bridges. They can break through rubble in some cases, but they generally just impact. They're like tanks, right? Like they impact the battlefield in a huge way, but they can reshape the battlefield by moving big objects in some cases. Or occupying a lot of space. They have the best stats, are not common, and take up 2 deploy slots when using them. Not all large units can manipulate the environment. Some are just exceptional support, damage dealers, etc. So large units, you're going to have to go out of your way to get them. The way I want to structure this game is there's not going to be like chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's going to be a starting area, and then you're going to branch off into different regions and take control of those regions for resources. So you're going to have to make a conscious decision. Like, oh, let's say your army is running low on water. Let's go seize the aqueduct. So now you have to go through like an aqueduct campaign, which will be like, I don't know, so many chapters. So like there will be like pros and cons, and I want there to be like timing. So like, for example, you could miss, like I'm going to make it so you can't get every single unit every playthrough. There's going to be like, if you pursue the aqueduct instead of the arboretum, for example, which could lead to getting more food, you're going to miss out on a unit in the arboretum. So that way there's like replay value baked into it. So I want like a lot of units, a lot of replay value. I want it to be like this forking thing where you ultimately will want to beat most of the chapters, most of the regions, but the resources, like you can't beat certain ones. Like you can't beat everyone every single time. So like you'll have like pros and cons for, what things you get and why. And I want there to be, like chapters where like there'll be certain end game chapters and stuff like that. I'm debating on if there should be multiple endings or not. This is still like early on in the development, but I do want there to be like forking paths. So like you choose different routes and end up in different places. And I think that'd be interesting. But the heavy units are going to be kind of rare. Like there'll be a handful of them, like 5 maybe throughout the entire playthrough. And you can only get like 2 to 3 on a given playthrough. You'll start off with 1 though. So you'll be able to play around with it. All right. Heavy units can get bottlenecked to certain parts of the level based on how much space there is, so that's one of the big downsides. They cannot move as freely as average and nimble units. Choke points and flank routes will be emphasized when using nimble and average units, while heavy units will be restricted to larger areas and have fewer mobility options. Some heavy units have the manipulate ability, that's what I was talking about earlier, which allows them to break down walls, stack heavy objects, so it can make like stairways or like a step in between. So like let's say there's a 2 high wall you can't get up, like two units high. You could have a heavy stack of pillar to create a 1x1 depth height thing. So then they can jump on the pillar and then jump on the wall, and now your entire army has access to a new region of the map because of the heavy unit. So it's definitely useful in that way. Clear out rubble, make space for themselves and their allies. So every map is going to have things that the heavy unit can manipulate, and then also some nimble units can tie ropes for other nimble units. So there could be just like high ground with like a little hook or something on it, and the nimble can tie a rope, and then they can all the nimbles can climb up there and grab high ground. So nimbles are going to be very flexible, but very high skill. An average will just be, some average units can boost each other. So for example, if there's a wall that's two units high, like 2 blocks high essentially, and you can only climb 1 block as an average unit, some average units can boost another average unit up, kind of like how in CSGO dudes boost each other onto high ground. So kind of like that. The next and final thing for this intro video is space and navigation. So this is just like a rough idea as to what it looks like visually when you're actually playing the game. Maps will be more/less accessible to certain unit types based on size. Heavy units will always need to occupy larger spaces that cannot fit through choke points or be supported by climbing small routes. Most maps will be based around average units, with every map having at least 2 to 3 or more nimble route options. So this is important because if you're trying to emphasize something, like if you have a mechanic in a game, right, and it's not always present, I think you have like a kind of problem. So like if I have this option for like nimble units to like go through like tight corridors or to walk on like balance beams or whatever, or like, they can like walk on like narrow ledges and get through all these different areas and climb and grab this like high ground specific to them. Every map at minimum has to have options for them. And if it doesn't, I've failed as a map designer, in my opinion. Some maps will be more open/narrow depending on the region. Yeah, so like some maps might be like wide open, but they'll still be nimble routes. And some maps might be like very claustrophobic and like tons of walls and tight spaces, so heavy units would have a hard time getting through, but would still be viable on these maps. Some heavy units can attack from far away or attack down choke points that they cannot traverse. So for example, you could position a heavy unit here and they could attack, like up to 2 or 3 range down here. Like let's say there's like a rat or something scurrying through here, nimble large rat, and they can attack down the choke point that they can't physically go down, but they can like stab their spear through it, right? So this is just like an option for them. But this is like a visual representation of, this is like not a full map, this is just like a tiny section of a map, but you can see this is like an average unit route where they can walk through this. So a nimble and average units can walk through here. Nimble can walk through here and then climb up to this and grab high ground and continue on. So only nimble can access this, only nimble and average can access this, anyone can access this. So this would be an example of like how heavies need to play around choke points. But let's say like the map wraps around, that there's like a heavy, like a large corridor that goes like this way, and then the nimbles are just on high ground, like shooting the enemies like a bow or something, or like throwing bombs at them or some kind of mechanic. This would be the advantage of nimbles, like being able to attack early, being able to contest nimble high ground, Because let's say the alternate is that there's enemy like mages, like nimble mages that are like throwing fireballs at you from up here, and you need something to be able to climb up there and fight it. That could be an example. But that's it for this introduction video. I'm still going to be working on the 3D models. I'm sculpting them in Zbrush from scratch for this game. It's going to take at least like 2 to 3 years to make this thing, but ideally we get a demo in like 6 months or so and then do a Kickstarter. But yeah, that's it for this one. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Thought this was interesting. This is the name of the game, to cast shadow on light. This logo is not final. This is just like a placeholder logo. The name is relevant to the plot, so, and I'll go over the plot in a future video. Like right now I just want to focus on game mechanics. I don't really want to talk about the story too much, so we're just going to be focusing on mechanics, balance, making the game a skill-based strategy game that you can't just run like a broken build and exploit. Like the key is I want players to master the game tactically and mechanically, and then reward players that do that, and then regularly add harder difficulties. Like every couple of months add a new harder difficulty and like push the AI a little bit. I won't do damage scaling difficulty because I think that's kind of like taking the easy way out. There will be like normal mode for people who just want to play it for the story or just want to play it and like chill out. They don't want to like, you know, go nuts trying to beat the hardest settings. But so yeah, that's it for this one. Definitely subscribe if you enjoyed this. We also have channel membership. Channel members can also influence things in the game. I'm going to be doing like monthly polls where I have like a bunch of things you can vote on for things you would want to see in the game or not. So any channel member can do that. And also the top 3 super chatters get their own character in the game that I'm going to be making from scratch based on what they want, as long as it fits within the game. That's for my live stream. But yeah, peace.